and start the recording. Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us this evening. My name is Kate Four, and I'm Executive Director for Vermont Woodlands Association. For those of you who are not familiar with Vermont Woodlands Association, we are a member-based statewide nonprofit that works with landowners, land managers, foresters, and other decision makers to help educate and advocate for the stewardship, use, and enjoyment of our private forests here in Vermont. So tonight's webinar is really actually a kickoff to our Climate and Carbon Resilience series, which is a month-long educational series that we're hosting with partners to help landowners really understand the implications of climate change, in our forests and the critical role in sequestering and storing carbon, as well as exploring a whole bunch of different strategies around helping our forests towards a more resilient future. I will be putting more information on the series in the chat box, but I encourage folks who are interested, please go ahead and check out our website, which is, you can be found at vtwoodlands.org for more information about both the series as well as all of the other programs that we offer throughout the year. So with that, on behalf of all of us with Vermont Woodlands Association, I'm so pleased to be hosting this webinar tonight. As we all know, one of the roles of Vermont's forests, or the role of Vermont's forests, is in storing and sequestering carbon is, a topic that I think is on many of our minds. Tonight's webinar is really intended to explore the regionally based research and science to help us understand the full story around forest carbon here in our forests. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Coeli Hoover, who is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service in the Northern Research Station in Durham, New Hampshire. Coeli said to me as we were talking about this webinar, she said, "I've been doing this work in forest carbon in the Northeast since forest carbon was cool." And I think that really speaks a lot to both her expertise and her passion for this work. Coeli is a ecosystem ecologist focused on studying forest carbon sequestration at the stand and landscape scales, and conducts a wide variety of studies on the effects of management practices on forest carbon sequestration. Her other tasks include developing tools for forest carbon estimation and conducting forest carbon training workshops for a whole variety of audiences across the United States as well as internationally. Coeli earned her BS in biology at the University of Pittsburgh and her PhD in ecology at the University of Georgia's Institute of Ecology. And so with that introduction, I'm just really pleased to have Coeli be joining us tonight and sharing all of her work on forest carbon here and helping us demystify forest carbon here in Vermont. So with that, Coeli, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to do this. This is absolutely one of the most favorite parts of my job. I have been in this game since 1999 when people were like, "What? Forest carbon?" So I've seen a lot of things. I've made a lot of holes. I've measured a bunch of trees. I've looked at a lot of data. So we're gonna have some fun tonight. I am gonna throw a lot of stuff at you, but it is okay. I will have a PDF of this available, so don't worry about trying to write stuff down. I can't see all of you, and I don't see a reactions bar. Is there a way to raise virtual hands, and can you see that, Kate? So at various points, I'm going to stop and say, "Are you with me? Do we have questions?"
Perfect. Yeah. So if folks want to go ahead and use that raised hand feature, I think most of us are probably pretty familiar with Zoom now, but in the reactions tab, you can go ahead and press that button and you'll have access to a hand raise. So you can go ahead and use that feature to ask questions or use the chat box.
There will be times when I will stop and ask for questions. And if you want to save them to the end, that's fine. But I know sometimes people will be so worried about trying to remember their question that then they're not focused. So we'll take a few stops, and my email will be in the PDF. I always joke that my brand is "I'm your friendly expert." Absolutely reach out, shoot me an email, get a hold of me if you have questions. I'm here to help. That's all part of my job. All right, so, okay. Am I not going to be able to use page down here? No, okay. So our little, I do hike a lot, and so you get a free sort of travelogue with every talk. So our trail map for this evening, some carbon basics, my soapbox of stocks and rates, a little bit I saw in the questions people submitted, a little bit of intro, just some key terminology for carbon markets. Then we're going to talk about changing the frame with some of the current debate and some sort of take-home tactics. And I haven't gotten to use polls before, so I'm really excited. I think we're going to have some fun with the polls. So here's our first poll question. Forest carbon is too complicated for regular people to understand.
Okay, so the way this works is people should be seeing a poll pop up in front of their screen right now, and you can go ahead and just click on your answer. Let me try that again. A little bit of a learning curve here. Now go ahead and try it. Now you should have some buttons. There we go. That looks better. Yeah.
Oh, all right. I like that. I wasn't
So
sure what to expect. That came out a lot more no's than I expected. So excellent.
So now everybody should be able to see with 88 people reporting. Here are the results. That's great.
All right. I think I can close this. All right, great. I didn't expect that, and I am happy. All right, on to our forest carbon basics. So sequestration is a word you hear a lot. I'm trying not to use it so much anymore because I've discovered that part of the confusion is that people are using it in several different ways. Pardon me if you hear jingling bells. That's my new research assistant who is busy with his toy. It's a feline research assistant. So I try not to use the word sequestration too much anymore. I try to use words like storage when I mean storage and accumulation when I mean accumulation. I think that helps reduce confusion. But photosynthesis, right? Plants are fixing the energy of the sun using carbon dioxide and water to fix that energy. And plant tissues are about 50% carbon by dry weight. So this carbon is temporarily removed or sequestered from circulation in the atmosphere. So that's where that term comes from. And this slows the rate of carbon dioxide accumulation. Right now, US forests are currently a carbon sink. They are storing carbon dioxide. I did not look up the estimate for last year. The US does report our forest carbon sources and sinks every single year as part of our international agreements. And that number bounces around a little bit depending on a number of factors. It's usually around 10%. It's been as high as 13. I think it's been as low as 9 in the time I've been paying attention. But right now, our forests are storing carbon. So the major greenhouse gases, we all hear about carbon dioxide, and that interacts with forests. Plants, as I just said, take up carbon dioxide. But just like us, plants are also respiring. They're giving off carbon dioxide, and then fires are another source. Methane, we don't hear as much about. Methane is taken up by soils. This is also emitted during forest fires. When you see that GWP, that's a warming potential number. And EPA puts a range on these. I picked a number from the middle of the range. What that 28 means. So methane does not last as long in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, but every molecule of methane warms 28 times more than a molecule of CO2. So you can see there's an impact there. Nitrous oxide is one that does not get a lot of press. You can see that's got a really high warming potential. That can be emitted from forest soils and agricultural soils under certain conditions, fertilizer and really wet soils. This is also emitted during fires. Water vapor, we never really talk about that. It's not a huge player, but it is a player. That's transpiration from trees. Carbon monoxide, you almost never hear about. Pretty low warming potential. Another thing that's emitted during forest fires. Then you see a bunch of chemical names down there, and they're in red because those are made by humans. They don't interact with forests. And all of these compounds have really high warming potentials, often in the 500s. And so they're really important, but they don't interact with forests. So what I like to call the forest carbon equation. So any given forest can be a source or a sink, and it can change back and forth over time and even within a growing season or a year. And this depends on a bunch of things, age class distribution, forest health and disturbance history, management practices, weather, and some other things. So as I said, overall, at this point in time, US forests are still acting as a carbon sink in the aggregate. However, certain places in the Southwest, those forests are a net source, and that's due to drought, fire, and the technical terms I like to use, bugs and crud. And all of these things interact. And so there are forests in places in the Southwest that are sources. Canada, unfortunately, we know they are really having a terrible fire season this year. Canada's boreal forests have been flipping back and forth over time, and they're definitely a source this year, and it is likely they may continue to be a source for some time. So we cannot take this for granted. The forest carbon sink isn't something that we can take for granted that's going to stay that way forever. So here's our next poll question. Forests can't make a difference, or maybe I would say like substantial difference to climate change.
That's on me. I'm working on it. Trying to get there we go. Sorry about that, guys. Sorry, a little delay there. So now you should have a poll in front of you. Perfect. See some folks are signing in.
This is going about how I expected, but you never know. So it looks like the vast majority of the group thinks that forests can, in fact, make significant impact on climate change. So I'm going to show you a slide this is from the Mauna Loa Climate Observatory. So it's on an island in Hawaii. They've been measuring carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere since 1960. So part of this is the rather alarming increase is one thing you're probably noticing. But the reason I'm showing this slide after that poll is I'm assuming everyone can see those wiggles in red line. So the black is the trend, and then the red are the actual measurements. And you can see there's quite a pronounced wiggle there, and it's about the same yearly. And what that wiggle is that's the influence of leaves on and leaves off in this hemisphere. So you can see there that forests absolutely really can influence the carbon cycle. And I think this slide is about the coolest way to kind of really make that point, that our forests really do have a role to play. Obviously, we have to cut emissions. We have to cut emissions dramatically, but forests definitely can do a pretty darn good job of capturing carbon dioxide. So this is a good point to ask if I've lost anybody yet, or if there's something on your mind that I didn't cover.
So just a reminder, folks, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box. Or if you want to raise your hand, we can have you chime in live. I don't see any questions at this point, Chili.
Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to pools. So I am an ecologist. So here is a classic box and arrow diagram. Everything in green is carbon that's been removed from the forest. And really, the important thing about this is that there are boxes and there are arrows. So carbon is flowing through these different pools. One of the things that will bug me is sometimes after we have a hurricane, a lot of trees get knocked down, and you'll hear a story about, oh, all this carbon was lost. Well, it wasn't lost. It didn't go poof to the atmosphere immediately. It went from live above ground biomass to down dead wood. And then from that point, it will slowly decompose, and some of it will be incorporated into the soil, and probably most of it will be emitted. So carbon transfers and flows among these different pools. That's really the whole point of this. Here are our major forest carbon pools that we often talk about. And again, there's a lot of international agreements behind all this as to what's counted. Our two biggest ones are live biomass above ground and below ground, most of it's above ground, and soils. Woody debris, which can take the form of logging slash too. That's one, your forest floor, standing dead trees, and products. Live biomass and soils are our two biggest ones, and which one is larger really depends on where you are. So the closer you are to the equator, the more of that carbon is above ground. The closer you get to the poles, the more of it is below ground. So where we are here in northern New England, I don't know the exact split because there isn't a lot of work where people sample soil down to bedrock, but we do have more below ground than above ground. And usually when we're thinking about carbon, we really focus on this live biomass pool because this is the one we can influence with management and where we can see fairly large changes fairly quickly. Soil carbon is really hard to detect change, and most things, unless you really have some dramatic soil disturbance, changes are usually pretty slow. So wood products do have a role to play. Harvested carbon goes to a lot of different places. When it's in a landfill, that is still actually sequestered. It will decompose slowly over time, but it is still stored for some time. Obviously, the different products have very different lifetimes, and so that has an impact. I always like to talk about my antique cherry drop leaf table, which is from the mid 1800s, and so that carbon has been rather nicely stored for some time, and it will stay stored. And that's why a lot of people are excited about these engineered wood products, CLT and others for a lot of reasons, but in carbon world, we're pretty excited about it because we can use some of the smaller wood, we can make these engineered products, which can be used for structural buildings, taller buildings. So that's not only locking up carbon, but it's also displacing concrete and steel, which have much higher emissions. So products are also something that are considered. So with that, I'm going to move on to how we measure change. And this is where things might get a little thorny. So we always want to know, how much carbon is the forest storing? And everybody's really used to, measuring volume, right? Everybody's been doing that. We're really good at that, been doing that for over a century. And really, this is very similar. So when you're talking about volume, you're talking about merchantable volume. And really what we're doing is kind of going to biomass. So we're talking about all of the tree, not just the merchantable parts. And then we convert that to dry biomass. And then carbon is about half that. So the two really do track. And we have equations that we use with the diameter of a tree, and some equations use height, and we do the math and figure out the biomass. So we're really, just like we would with timber, we're measuring the carbon in the forest at 2 points in time, and then we're taking the difference. Sometimes this might be compared against a baseline. And there's two ways this can be expressed: in absolute terms, so tons of carbon total in your forest, in your county, in your state, whatever your unit is, or on a per area basis. And these slides will probably have a mix of units. It's the plague of forest carbon that forestry in the US is in imperial units and science is all in metric. And so I'm always having to flip back and forth. And so there's probably a few things in here that are metric. I do all my work on a per area basis, because if I told you had 50,000 tons of carbon, is that a lot? I mean, you have nothing to judge that against, and it depends on the land area. So I always put things on a per acre or per hectare basis, because then we can kind of put that in context more. So all we do is we just take time 2 carbon, time 1 carbon, and the difference, and that's your net change. But this quantity isn't always super helpful, because what if you're trying to compare a spruce fir forest with the northern hardwoods with a heavy sugar maple component? I mean, you don't have much of a way to compare them because they're really different. What if they have really different amounts? What if one of your stands was really high graded and it's in bad shape, and then you've got this nice healthy stand? Well, they started from really different places, so I think it's challenging to compare them. So this is where I use a quantity that I call average annual change, and it's really just like a timber yield. So it's your carbon at time 2 minus your carbon at time 1. And then you just divide by the number of years between time 2 and time 1. And then you get your average annual change. This is almost always expressed on a per area. So tons per acre per year or metric tons per hectare per year. And then you get a feeling, you have this number and you can compare it across treatments, your forest types, whatever is of interest to you. So you're looking at that rate of change. So that's a really handy way to compare. And this is a fun slide. One day, it actually took me several hours to do this math, but I thought it was sort of fun. What does a ton of carbon look like anyway? So this is a English ton, short ton. So if we thought of a 2x4, and because of specific gravity, I used a pine 2x4 that's 8 feet long. That's 3.5 pounds of carbon, about. So a ton of carbon will be 572 2x4s. And you can't, I'm sitting down and you can't really see me, but I am 5.5 feet tall, which is why our stack of boards is 5.5 feet tall. So it would be a stack 1 Coeli tall and just under 4 feet wide. And that would be a ton of carbon. And someday I'm going to get someone to stack up 2x4s. So here we go to a really important, now we're really getting into what you in Vermont are, and other places, but I know you're really dealing with this. So this poll question now, the best way to store carbon is to favor these large old trees.
Looks like we got about 75% participating. And I'll go ahead and share those results.
Okay. I didn't really have preconceptions about how I thought this was going to go. So that is interesting. All right. So
Great.
now
So,
we're getting.
and Tilly, there are 2 questions in the chat box if this isn't a okay time. So the first question is from Philip. Why does carbon vary with leaves? When they are on in the northern hemisphere, they are off in the south and vice versa. Shouldn't it all balance out?
It's just the forest type distributions because we have so much deciduous forest and also I think part of it is that tower's in Hawaii. So it's seeing this hemisphere. I'm assuming that if you put a tower in a similarly appropriate place in the southern hemisphere, you would get that same. That's my guess.
Great.
Good question, though.
And then a question from Thomas. How do you measure soil carbon? Thoughts on that?
Yes, I have made a lot of holes. It's challenging. I don't do a lot of this work anymore because forest soil properties are extremely spatially variable. So if I made a hole and I walked 2 feet away and made another hole, I'd probably get a difference. Sort of classically, we always think of an important change as, we're looking for like 10% of the mean. And in soils, you could move 2 feet and easily get a difference. So trying to figure out how to detect change against that background noise is tough. What I have done is used a slide impact hammer core. So I make a lot of 2-inch diameter holes down to 20 centimeters. You have core sleeves, so I can do 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and 10 to 20. So I make a bunch of small holes spread out over an area to try to capture the spatial variability. But you can't go super deep because I'm also an expert on New England coarse fragments in New England forest soils. And it's really hard with that approach to get much deeper than 20 centimeters. So you can also just dig one big pit, and then you can go down to bedrock if somebody really likes to dig. But now you're making one big hole. So there's a trade-off there. And also sometimes people get really mad if you make big holes, even when you put it back. And then you dry the soils, and then there's a chemical analysis that's done, and it gets between the labor, if you're making a lot of small holes, the prep, and the analysis, it's pretty expensive. Unfortunately, there's really no super easy way to do it, aside from making one big hole or a lot of little holes and then sending it off to the lab. That's a good question.
Great. Those are the two questions we have as of now. So I think we can move on. Thanks.
Okay, we're coming to my soapbox. This is the soapbox I have been standing on since probably 2001. And I added a new soapbox last year, but this is my big one. So this is, but you want to focus on the green bars. The others show some other pools. This is from the Cane Experimental Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. So it's an Allegheny hardwood forest, which means it's a subset of northern hardwoods, dominated by beech and black cherry. And there's also, sugar maples and your other northern hardwoods in there too. This study was installed in 1975 with different thinning types to develop a decision support tool for managing this forest type. And they were trying to figure out which management treatments, what the results were and what would be best. So there's a thin from below represented here. They were all thinned to exactly the same, 70% relative density. It was all one big piece of land. Everything looked really similar before they started the study. At this point in time, they had been treated twice. The thin from above is exactly what it sounds like. It turns out to be a very severe high grade. They took all the big, it was a merciless work from the biggest trees down. Below was work from the smallest trees up. And then we have the control. So if you look at stock, this is the carbon in the bank. It's a snapshot in time. So this is showing you the carbon after that measurement in 2000. And again, this can be per acre or the whole stand. Now, if these areas had different initial conditions, that's not going to be shown in the numbers. So this is like, if we just called up your bank balance today, it's what's in your bank account right now. It doesn't tell us, we don't know anything about what was in there a month ago. So this is stock. This is carbon stock, carbon on the stump, carbon in the bank. I want you to fix this picture in your brain. So when people are talking about big old trees are the best way to store carbon, they're talking about stock. When you go in and read those papers, they're focused on standing stock of carbon in the forest. That's one part of the forest carbon equation, but it's not the only part, right? There's also change. There's a rate of accumulation. So now what I'm going to show you next is the difference between that first measurement period. And so this is a 25-year, the rate over the 25 years of the study at that point in time. Same stands, same data set. They've been treated twice. All right, everyone ready? That looks different, doesn't it? This is the change in live above ground biomass. This is the rate of change, the interest on the carbon in the bank. This is that average annual change that is really useful for comparing forest types, where you are in the state, treatments, age class, whatever you want to compare. You are not comparing the net change. You are comparing the rate of change. The difference is not always this dramatic, but you can see if you only looked at this, you can see that the thin from above, it definitely has less carbon in it. You can see that gives you a very different picture from looking at the rates. So you do need more data because you need 2 points in time, but I always encourage people to consider both sides of this coin. And which one you want to emphasize more is really going to depend, like anything else, on your objectives, right? If we are focused on trying to mitigate carbon and pull carbon down now, I would say we might want to emphasize the rates perhaps a little bit more. We don't want to go all in on just rates, right? This is a lot like your retirement portfolio. You have a mix of investments. And what that mix is depends on your objectives and how close you are to retirement. So this is very similar. But you really need to remember that there are two sides to this, that it's not all just about carbon on the stump. So again, both of these quantities are useful. Stocks, net change in stock, if you want to know. I did some work at Gifford Woods. How much carbon is in that forest and that park? Okay, that's a stock question. If you want to know, if you had the data from 20 years ago, how much did it store over the past 20 years? That's a net change in stock. But if you wanted to compare maybe that old growth sugar maple stand to another part of the forest, that's when you would use that rate of change, because now everything's on that tons per acre per year, and you can compare that rate of change because you don't have the same initial conditions. So just that net number is not always useful for comparisons. Okay, this is another time to see if there are questions about that soapbox.
So, giving folks just a few minutes to digest that. I don't see any questions at this point.
Okay, there will be time at the end. So that is a really important point. So now I'm going to go to the big picture. This is the Bowl Research Natural Area in the White Mountains. What do we know about how forests store carbon? Okay, young forests, as I said, there's not much carbon in a young forest, but they grow really quickly. Not much in the bank, high interest rate. So using the set of equations I like to use for biomass, a 2-inch diameter sugar maple tree has just under 8 pounds of carbon. And I'm talking above ground, not in the roots. Just above 8 pounds, just under. Fast growth rate. So they're storing carbon at a high rate, high interest rate, but there's not a lot of carbon there. Older forests have a lot of carbon, and you know this, they have a lot of carbon stored in them, but they grow more slowly. So they're storing carbon at a slower rate than the younger forests, but they have a lot more carbon in the bank. So using those same equations, so our 2-inch sugar maple had just under 8 pounds of carbon. 12-inch sugar maple has 421 pounds of carbon. And an 18-inch sugar maple, 3,238 pounds of carbon. So that size really does matter. So high stock, but a lower rate of accumulation, right? Because as forests age, that growth rate slows down. This is from a paper Jim Smith and I just published, and this is metrics, sorry. We just published in January or February. So I define Northeast a little more broadly than some do. And so this is all of New England, this is Pennsylvania, New Jersey, West Virginia, because their forests are more similar than to the south. And so this is forest inventory and analysis data for that region. The green bars are the rate of carbon uptake. So metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. And that black line is the stock in tons of carbon per hectare. And this is a very typical pattern. We did this for regions in the whole country. And the places we saw difference were in areas where there's high harvesting. And it was the age classes that are primarily harvested in those regions. So you can see rates go down and stocks go up as forests age. So this is just another really good reason to plan for a range of age classes across the landscape. This is a old growth beech hemlock forest, again, in northwestern Pennsylvania. Area is very prone to wind. In the mid-'80s, there were an awful lot of tornadoes. And so this was maybe 12 years after that. So now, now it's a younger age class. But when we have that, you know, we've got our high stock low rate and our low stock high rate, and we've got that mixture across the landscape. This is another example. This is from a study from the Bartlett Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. This is a crop tree thinning. And the point here is that your time frame matters. So the black bar was the whole duration of the study up through the last time it had been measured, which was 1990. And the green bar is the measurement period right after that thinning treatment. So a heavy crop tree thin, a light crop tree thin, and then no thinning. And so you see over the duration of the study, those rates averaged out to be pretty similar, but immediately after thinning, you had a much higher uptake rate. And that's why I'm a really big fan of timber stand improvement and doing some thins from below, because you can take a stand that's 60 years old or so, 70, and slowing down, thin it out, and get some nice, not only are you getting timber quality benefits and growth benefits, but you're also getting a nice bump up in your carbon uptake. And just from looking at a lot of long-term data from forest experiments, over the long term, and again, these are different thinnings to different densities, so different levels of partial harvesting, not a full complete harvest. Usually the thin plots and the controls all wind up over the long term with about the same amount of biomass, but the rate of accumulation is often quite different, especially in that period following the treatment. So, are your goals short-term or long-term? That time frame you're looking at is another important thing to consider when we're thinking about strategies for carbon and how that fits with our other forest management goals. It's not all 100 years from now. It's not all, oh, we took a dip in our carbon, we pulled carbon off the landscape when we thinned. Yes, but that rate is going to be a lot higher. So it's just a matter of having that context. So any questions there before we do a little hop into markets?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions that have come in, Shelley. One from Philip, which I think you sort of just ties directly to what you were just saying. His question is, so from the carbon standpoint, we should cut all old big trees and make lumber or furniture, since they are no longer removing much carbon, and let new trees grow, which will rapidly store carbon.
So my question would be, if you looked at your retirement portfolio, should you take all of your CDs and savings accounts and liquidate them and buy high yield stocks with them? Probably not. You probably want a mixture of those things as a hedge, right? You want to have cash on hand and you want to have a return, an interest rate. So this is the same. We want to have a mixture, and I'm going to move into that a little bit more after the markets. We want to have that mixture where we have that mixture of age classes across the landscape. Because when you harvest carbon, only about 50% of that goes into products, and the rest of it, some gets burned, some gets landfilled, some decomposes. So we want to have a mixture. So we have our big old trees, our carbon in the bank. But if we only had everything in that, we would have a low interest rate. And then if anything happened to that age class, it might be really prone to wind throw. Now we're really, now we could be in a bit of a pickle. So we want to have a mixture of age classes across that landscape as a bet hedging. And I will go into this more. So the more diversity we have in every component, the more we have a hedge against what is going to happen in the future.
Great. Thanks so much, Shelley. There was a question before that about could you just talk for a second and explain the above and below ground carbon? Just re-ground us in the above versus below.
So when we talk about, so there's the soil pool, which is, there's all different kinds of compounds in the soil, and some stick around for thousands of years and some cycle very quickly. But when we talk about below ground carbon with trees, we're talking about roots. And we're really specifically talking about coarse roots. So to fine roots, which are usually defined as, I don't know who made this up, 2 millimeters or less, those get lumped in with soil. Coarse roots we generally do by math, because doing them empirically is really hard. It requires large bulldozers, or sometimes fire hoses. You get the fire department to blast all the soil away from roots. It's really destructive and it's hard to do. So there are some equations. It's about 20% of above ground biomass. So it's roots really, but it's science. So we call it below ground biomass. Usually I'm just talking about what's above ground because it's a pretty standard 20% for below ground, and those are going to mirror each other. But that's a good question.
Okay. Well, there is one more question from Thomas. Is the rate of accumulation you're showing per pound of the tree or per pound, regardless of size? Sorry, and let me say that again. I'm sorry, my cursor got in the way and I couldn't actually read it clearly. Okay, let me try that again. So the question is from Thomas, and it is the rate of accumulation you're showing per pound of tree or per tree, regardless of size?
It's for that whole, for the whole stand, or with the Northeast, for all of the FIA plots that were included in the analysis. So it's tons of carbon, those are metric tons of carbon accumulation per hectare per year. So really, if you think about, board feet per acre per year that you would do on a stand level, or cords, I hate cords, they're really hard to convert. It's a similar quantity. It's just we're talking about carbon instead.
Great. Thanks for clarifying. I think that's it. There was a sort of clarification around the thinning question, excuse me, the above and below ground question referring to the thinning slide, but I think you brought us there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Most everything I'm presenting is above ground only because it's going to come out the same. What you're going to do isn't really going to affect the one, and it's just mentally easier for people to focus on the parts of the trees that we see. And the math is definitely better.
Awesome. These are great questions. Thanks everybody and please keep them coming. And I'll turn things back over to you, Chili, to talk about markets.
We're going to hop into markets. I am not an expert on markets. This is a very dynamic space. It is changing all the time. So what I'm just going to do is really try to, we're sitting on Hedgehog Mountain now in the White Mountain National Forest. It's my favorite little mountain. You should go there. And I'm just going to basically introduce you to some important vocabulary and concepts, because I know there were a lot of questions about markets. So some really important terms. Additionality, this is the big one. Almost everything has an additionality test. So this is the carbon stored as a result of the project has to be above and beyond what would occur in the absence of the project. So this is usually defined against a baseline. So that's the reference against which carbon storage is measured. This is a policy choice. There's no scientific definition of the ultimate baseline. Sometimes a base year might be used, like for the Kyoto Protocol, it was 1990. Often a business as usual scenario could be based on regional average from forest inventory and analysis data. It varies depending on the program. But in general, you will probably not get any credits for just sitting around looking at your trees grow. There has to be something that's above and beyond what would occur in the absence of the project. Permanence is another important one. How this is handled, again, it varies from program to program, but you want these carbon gains to be lasting, to be real and to be lasting. California requires a 100-year time frame, which really puts that out of reach for a lot of folks. Sometimes easements might be required. Again, different ways of dealing with it, but additionality, baseline, and permanence are really key terms. Leakage is another one. This one is really hard to quantify. Economists try. Sometimes it's more of like a risk analysis. But what you want to do is make sure, again, we want these to be real tons that are stored. So you want to make sure that the project isn't causing carbon losses elsewhere, resulting in no net change. So if Kate is going to do her big project, and then that might cause Fred down the road to say, oh, the heck, I've been thinking of moving anyway. We're just going to clear cut it and turn it into a subdivision or something. So now that's leakage. We haven't actually gotten anywhere. So that one's a little hard to think about. Risk of reversal. This is also handled in a lot of different ways. How are you sort of ensuring the project against carbon loss from fire, disease, whatever. This is handled in a lot of different ways. Some might require you need to store 20% more than your contracted level of projected tons in order to cover losses. Bunch of different ways to handle that. MRV is an acronym you'll see a lot: monitoring, reporting, and verification. And that is maybe handled by a third party. It's, you know, making sure that those tons are really there and that they're stored. And that is what tends to get expensive. Common, this is not exhaustive, these are just common types of projects. Avoided conversion. Generally, you would need to show that the land was at a high risk of conversion to a non-forest use. Again, probably not going to get paid for keeping the forest you were going to keep anyway, and looking at it. Extended rotation length, deferring harvest is another one. You know, when I've done some work with this, I don't see that it necessarily gets you huge gains, but this is a popular project type, with the notion being, you know, keep that carbon on the stump longer and hopefully maybe bump it up into a longer lived product class. So there's probably certain areas where that might make sense, that people might harvest pulp, and if that will push them into saw timber, but that is a common project. Improved forest management. This takes a lot of different forms. Some programs will specify what practices are eligible. Some don't. An example would be the thinning, the timber stand improvement work would be a form of improved forest management. In the West, we are starting to see they're finalizing the registries, the approval process for projects to reduce wildfire risk. So this does entail removing carbon from the landscape, but with the notion of preventing larger carbon loss due to wildfires. So that's a project type that is going to be coming into the picture soon in the West. And again, there's all other flavors. These are just common ones that you might hear about. There's two main types of markets. So one is the regulatory or compliance market, and the example for this is California. So this is established by law, and all the protocols, the methods, the terms, they're all mandated in that law. Then there's the voluntary market, which again, very dynamic space. Credits are generally purchased by businesses. They might be purchased by environmental organizations and retired and not traded. So these credits are a fungible, tradable item. The protocols and terms will vary by the program and the registry. And you can think of registries, there's a bunch of them, as being almost like a stock exchange. So, you know, each registry has its protocols and its way of doing things, and the requirements and practices will vary by the registry, but they're the ones doing that certification process. So the challenges for landowners, the higher the quality of that credit, the higher the price you will get is, and that also depends on supply and demand in the market. But the higher quality usually means those higher MRV costs. And that means, unfortunately, that many programs are better suited to large landowners for this reason. If you think about improved forest management, if things weren't so great, you do a really good job, you might bump up in the Northeast by 0.5 ton an acre per year. So how many acres do you need to really get that number up? And then when you have the monitoring, reporting, and verification costs, that gets really expensive. Throughout my career, I've always hoped that there might be a point where there could be portfolios where some agency or organization could act as an aggregator and bond together a bunch of properties and do projects that would maybe defray that cost and allow smaller landowners to participate. But I haven't really seen much action there. There are some new, if anyone's heard of the Nature Conservancy's Family Forest Carbon Program, which is, I had a lot of interaction with them early on. They're very interested in that thinning work, and improved forest management is one of their practices. They're going to a payment for practice model that are aimed at smaller landowners. So it doesn't have all those requirements. You're just paying, you're being paid to implement a practice. Because of the recognition that these programs are really quite burdensome for smaller landowners. Just a few more key points about credits. Transparency and rigors in the methods, questions that come up. Do the data need to be field collected, or does that method rely on models? Is there a remeasurement? This is what gets expensive, right? Anytime we put boots on the ground, you've got people out there measuring trees. That's person hours, and that gets expensive. Another thing, question is, how is the baseline set? Because that varies, and that may affect your ability to participate. And, are you talking about a tradable credit or a payment for practice? Okay, I see another poll question, which means this is a time to ask again. I'm not an expert on markets, but if there's any questions that I might be able to answer on that.
Yeah, so there is a question from actually there's a few questions here. There's a question from Philip about you mentioned a ton per acre per year, I assume. The question is, how does a program like California's pay for half a ton? Half a ton, I think is the question.
Well, it would be, those projects are huge. So that's what I'm saying. You need a lot of acres. If your management is going to bump you up and net you an additional half a ton an acre per year, you need an awful lot of acres in order to make your costs of participating in that pay, because you've got all these monitoring, reporting, and verification costs. And so that's what makes it, improved forest management has a lot of benefits, but also it means, that you need, there are some projects that have gone into New England, but they're really large projects. 20,000, 30,000, 60,000 acres. So that's the challenge for small landowners, is that meeting those MRV requirements is pretty pricey. Need a lot of acres.
Okay. And so that's where programs like the Family Forest Carbon Program, with the Nature Conservancy and American Forest Foundation, I think come into play.
And I think there's other ones that are coming along too in that same kind of payment for practice model, because we all know this. We know that this is just not within the realm for smaller landowners.
So there's a question from Ram. So with the regulated markets, the credits are not resold to businesses for offsetting.
That's the regulatory. So people, I do, again, not an expert on this. I do believe they contract, but they've got everybody, it's a cap and trade. So I don't know how those caps get assigned, but you've got to stay under the cap. So they're buying those to get under their cap. But it's a little different than in the voluntary market, where you don't have caps and you might be meeting your net zero targets for your organization, and those are retired. I don't know. The California one, it's like this 100-year time frame, which essentially sort of takes that question off the table. That's how they deal with permanence, is you've got to have an easement and it's a 100-year time frame.
Great. That's interesting. Thanks. I think that's it for questions for now. And again, some of these questions, I do feel like, folks, if you want to mute yourself and put your hand up, it could also just be just as easy for you to ask them in person. So feel free to do that.
Okay, here's our next poll. You can't manage a forest for carbon and other values like timber or wildlife habitat.
Coming, folks. I think I just got it up.
And I have got to pick up my pace a little bit. I just looked at my watch and I'm like, whoa, got a bunch more to get through here. Okay.
This one is, you haven't fooled anybody yet.
Well, I wasn't sure. I didn't know what was going to happen there. Some people would say that's true. So we're going to change the frame. And this is really what comes in with the debate we're seeing a lot with the pro-forestation community, where they're making sort of we shouldn't manage anything because forests are just for carbon and we cannot do both of these things. So there's always a tension between scales, right? We operate at a stand level scale. We don't have a choice. That's the reality. But we have to plan our projects in the context of that larger landscape. And then with climate, we're thinking about what the atmosphere sees. But we always tend to focus on that stand scale and that project scale because that's what's right in front of us. And I also think we have a general bias as humans toward framing things in either or terms, right? It's carbon or it's timber, and it's timber or it's wildlife. But many situations are both and. And again, this is where your spatial scale matters as well. Also, I think we tend to think in terms of maximizing a quantity. We want to maximize the amount of carbon in the woods. But I think it's often more useful to think of optimizing, especially when in natural resources, we're always juggling multiple objectives, right? So we're looking for an optimal solution. So carbon is really just another piece of the forest management puzzle that you've all been solving all along. So I want to encourage you to remember to think it's carbon and whatever your objective is, not carbon or. And these trade-offs occur over the larger landscape. We are not managing for every value on every single acre under our nose. It's the trade-offs across the landscape, not that project or stand scale. So my new soapbox as of last year is managing for the and. Now, some utility companies and some businesses probably can afford to buy a chunk of land and plant a carbon forest. But most people, carbon's the frosting on the cake. It's not the cake. It's an additional value for most and not the primary management objective. We're looking at that larger landscape. And again, we're trying to find an optimal solution. So I've looked at a lot of data, I've spent a lot of time in the woods on a lot of field tours, talking to a lot of silviculturists and operational folks. And there's just nothing that indicates that the objectives of carbon and sustainable timber management or wildlife habitat, they're just not mutually exclusive. And in fact, they're really pretty complementary. So I think of framing managing for resilience, an optimal stocking level. We want nicely stocked stands. We don't want to be understocked, but we don't, especially out west, we don't want to be overstocked. We're diverse mix of species and age classes across the landscape. You know we've had drought in the past. We've got a heck of a lot of rain this time. We've got bugs and crud. So we're setting up our forests. If we have that mixed at an appropriate stocking level, we're setting up our forests to better handle these multiple stressors. So coming back to those stocks and rates, I think a key ingredient in this recipe for resilience is a mix of age classes, right? We know species diversity is important. We're used to hearing about that. But these age classes are important too. We want carbon in the bank and carbon earning interest. And again, some age classes are really prone to certain types of disturbance. So if you're really overbalanced, you put all your eggs in that basket and something wipes that age class out. Now you don't have as much carbon in the bank and you don't have these intermediate age classes ready to go. So diversity is a bed hedging strategy. Also really important for wildlife objectives, right? You also want to mix the species and age classes across the landscape. Good sustainable timber management, good wildlife habitat management, good forest health management, and it's great carbon management. So I took this picture on the Bartlett Experimental Forest, early successional habitat, very high rate of carbon uptake, and also lunch. Really important for neotropical migrants and a lot of our native species as well. So the and then don't forget scale. So this picture down here was 2 years ago. It's like an 8-acre patch cut on the Bartlett Experimental Forest. This is a canopy height map I made from LiDAR data. It's not the entire Bartlett Experimental Forest, but most of it. And you can see there's very few dark patches and they're pretty small. So most of this forest is closed canopy, mid to late successional. So when somebody's looking at a clear cut and they're getting upset and, oh, you're clearing the land, in the larger context, it's a very small area in this larger lands. So my take home message is when you find yourself in this situation where somebody's saying we shouldn't manage, we have to just worry about climate. We want to maintain that forest carbon sink, right? It's not guaranteed to be a sink forever. We want to maintain that sink over the long term rather than just maximizing the stock. Consider your projects in the landscape context and over that longer term. Manage for the and. Carbon and other objectives are usually complementary. Aim for a diverse mix of species and age classes across that landscape at an appropriate stocking level. Good ways to communicate this with people, make it tangible. You know, you see that clear cut, show somebody one that's 5 or 6 years old. They don't want to go in there. Sound recordings, you know, breeding bird season in the spring. What does a 4-year-old, 5-year-old clear cut sound like? It's a pretty noisy place. One really important note I have noticed in the pro-forestation literature, you will see the term deforestation used, you will see the term clearing used. Deforestation has internationally agreed on definition. It is land use change. Deforestation is you cut down the trees and you put up a solar farm. You cut down the trees and you put them up a McMansion. You put up whatever, you made a pasture. Clear cutting with regeneration to forest is forest remaining forest. It is forest management. It is considered that way internationally. It is not deforestation. It is not clearing. I have seen that a lot. And so be aware of that and be ready to say, no, that's not the correct usage. Use financial analogies like a retirement portfolio to highlight how most of us don't keep everything in high earning stocks. Most of us don't keep everything in CDs or your savings account. We have a mixture. The nature of that mixture varies depending on our objectives. Really resist that either or framing. You can have bunnies and board feet. And then remember that bird's eye view, that landscape level, that we're not doing everything on every acre. We're looking across that larger landscape. And what is our goal? And I would argue that we all have the same goal. The people arguing for no management at all, we really all want a healthy forest landscape, right? But the way to get that is not necessarily to just walk away. We cannot take that forest carbon sink for granted. We all want to make sure that this doesn't become this in the end. And so that's kind of another thing to highlight. So I'm going to skip this poll question because you didn't buy that. And you didn't really buy this one either. So we can skip both of these because, well, people did kind of buy this one. So let's do this poll question again.
All right, I'm going to pop it up here.
We'll skip the other one because you didn't buy that one.
So we have, I don't think you fooled them, Jelly.
Well, I think this was the one we had a mixture of things before.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I have one more poll question.
Oh, did I pull up the wrong? Okay, let me grab the other one.
So this one is, I've got this.
Got it.
And I think answers are.
Hold on, I'm launching it. There you go.
Yep. There we go. Yes, no,
Sorry.
not quite, but I'm less confused than before.
There we go.
Okay. Some people are still deciding.
And when I'd haste, I went ahead and closed it. So I apologize if somebody was still waiting to enter theirs in, but looked like most of the results had been calculated and sent in. So looks like we have about 80% people responding, and kind of still a little bit of a mix, but I just, it's phenomenal that there's no no's, right? It's,
Yeah.
I think the conversation tonight is really highlighted, that there's always more to learn. But
So
we
I
got
will
this.
take that result. And somebody had asked a question in the registration about Vermont's forests compared to others. And I didn't make a slide, but I pulled some numbers from the paper we just published. And that whole northeastern region, the mean carbon storage, the average is about 71 tons per hectare. Sorry, I didn't convert it. And the youngest age class is 15 and a half. And then I picked like the 80 to 120 is like 88.4. And the landscape is 4% in the 0 to 20 on average and 34% in the 80 to 120. And then the overall rate was a little over a half ton per acre. And then in 0 to 20, that was 1.47. And then the 80 to 120, it was 0.27. So Vermont, the stocks in Vermont are pretty similar to the Northeast average. And the landscape breakdown is pretty similar. You've got 3% in 0 to 20 and 36% in 81 to 120 years old of forest area. But the rates were kind of interesting. There weren't enough FIA plots in Vermont in that youngest age class to calculate a rate, but the 41 to 60 rate was 0.87 tons per hectare per year, when the regional average was 0.7. So that was higher. And the 81 to 120 was actually 0.67, which is definitely higher than the regional average. And those numbers, the stocks are similar to here in New Hampshire, but your rates were a little bit higher. So someone did ask that question of how Vermont compared. So your rates are actually a little bit higher than the regional average, and your stock and age class breakdown are pretty similar. And now I will stop talking and let you hop in with questions and what time we have left.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Well, thank you, Charlie, for just a really in-depth conversation tonight, just really demystifying. That was the goal of the presentation tonight, was really to kind of go through some of the language and talk about all these different sort of components to the story of how forest carbon works here in Vermont. And so I know for myself, all these metaphors have just really helped me kind of get my head around it. So thank you so much for making it easier for us to understand, and also helping us kind of connect some of these concepts and terms to the work that we're trying to do here in Vermont to keep our forests healthy. I would love if there's other questions, feel free to go ahead and put your hand up or to add them to the chat. We have a few more minutes left in the webinar this evening. I do want to just remind folks that this webinar was actually approved. I meant to mention it in the beginning, but we do have SAF credits approved for the webinar tonight. So if you're a forester or consulting forester looking for SAF credits, I will send an email out with those certificates after the session to this evening, so folks can get those credits. And so with that, feel free to share any last minute questions. While we're waiting for other questions to come in, I guess I'm curious to hear from folks, like what are some of your ahas? I know for myself, like I said, some of the language and some of the terms for me tonight really came together. This idea of stocks versus rates, the idea of like, what does a ton of carbon look like? I'm not going to forget that anytime soon. In fact, actually having, done a lot of construction work this summer, I think it was it 527 2x4s. I felt like, that visualization was just really helpful for me to get my head around this. So what other ahas are folks had this evening? Feel free to share those in the chat box as well. There is another question that has come in about sending out the PDF. The session this evening has been recorded, so I will be posting the recording of the webinar on our YouTube channel with Vermont Woodlands Association, as well as Chile will make a PDF of the presentation, and I'll be sending that out to folks. So with that, I don't see any questions coming in, so I think we can take that as a sign that people are still absorbing all this great information. Thank you so much, Shelley, on behalf of all of us, on behalf of Vermont Woodlands Association. I do want to mention, and I'll put in the chat box, this is the first of our series coming up. We have a number of other events throughout the rest of the month, walks in the woods, and a workshop next Saturday on climate adaptation in partnership with Audubon and Vermont Land Trust. So feel free to check out all of our other programs and the work that we do at Vermont Woodlands Association. There is a question from Philip here in the chat, just talking about sort of still not sure if he agrees with the comparison of forest age with mixed stock portfolios, but my stock portfolio will theoretically be all the same, spent one day, and talking about, it still seems like cutting old trees that are no longer storing much carbon makes more sense.
And the issue with that is that it's not a 100%. So some of that is going into products like my table or, for structural lumber. But when you're cutting those trees, a lot of that carbon is going to other places where it will rapidly decompose. So you now have a kind of a big debit on your ledger sheet. And because the trees that are coming in are so much smaller, it's going to take them years. So they're adding, so it's like you might put a little money into a stock that earns a high interest rate. So there's not a big investment in there. And it's going to take a while before that nest egg grows. So, across that landscape, you want to have a balance, but you will definitely have a big debit on your ledger sheet that's going to take quite a while if you remove a lot. And we don't have a lot of big old trees. So they're kind of like your CDs. And that's why it's good to have that balance. Or mixture, I don't want to say balance, but you want to have a mixture of things. And the nature of that mixture is going to vary. But for the incoming age classes to take up as much carbon and have that storage on the landscape is going to take quite a while. Even in southern pines, to get them, I mean, they grow pretty quickly, right? But you're still going to have, so your balance sheet's going to have quite a debit on it if you did that, because depending on the product, usually 50% of what comes out, what was harvested, is turned into products, and the rest might be burned for energy along the way or lost.
That's great.
And I will say, do feel free. You will have my email. It will be in the PDF. Absolutely, don't hesitate to reach out with questions.
Excellent, Shelley. Well, this has been absolutely phenomenal. Really appreciate your time tonight. I hope that this is, the start of continuing to work together and partnering, to share all this research, because it's clear that, throughout your career, you've done a ton of work, really exploring this issue and really starting to kind of help us all understand, sort of how the carbon forest system works here in Vermont and throughout the Northeast. So thank you for all your research. Thank you for all the work you've done. And thank you for sharing this presentation with us tonight. And we look forward to having you back. I think tonight was just, like you said, if carbon is the icing on the cake of the forest, my hope is that tonight's presentation is just really the icing on the cake of all of us just really trying to understand this issue more deeply. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, for participating, for all the great questions. And thanks again, Shelley, for your time and sharing all this great work.
You're welcome. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you everybody again for joining us tonight. I think we are at our time. So we again hope that everybody, other folks will continue to consider to, join us for future programs. And again, thank everybody for your time and participation tonight. Great to see you all here and to have this conversation. So thanks again, Shelley. We'll let you go. Have a good evening and look forward to working with you more in the future.
Absolutely.